If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine, and maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them, from disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, you know, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
The People of Praise, a secretive Christian faith group that counts the conservative Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett as a member, considered women's obedience and subservience to men as one of its central early teachings, according to leaked remarks and writings of the wife of one of the group's founders. A leaked video of a recent private People of Praise event marking its 50th anniversary shows Dorothy Ranahan explaining how some female followers of the faith group cried intensely in reaction to the group's early teachings on headship and the roles of men and women, in which men are considered divinely ordained as the head of the family and dominant to women. Asked in an interview during the anniversary event about the years after the group's members first made a covenant to join People of Praise in the early 1970s, Dorothy Ranahan said, "Some of the women, who are still in my women's group, as a matter of fact, were wearing sunglasses all the time because they were always crying and would have to hold onto their chairs every time somebody started teaching, because what are we going to hear this time?" She then added, as the audience and her interviewer laughed, "But it all worked out just fine in the end." Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's mini-series on the People of Praise, a group we have not yet covered on the show. At almost 300 episodes in, that sounds wild. But as we all know at this point, and as the late great Margaret Singer once said, there are cults in our midst. And as the great Alexandra Stain said on the recent BBC documentary A Very British Cult, cults are not exotic groups that exist far away from us. They are all around us. I myself notice cultic elements all around me in everyday life since doing this work. Tell me, listeners, has this happened to you? This episode comes with a trigger warning. There will be some clips of music and tongues used, which I recognise may be a trigger to some. There is also a lot of political talk in this conversation, given the involvement of certain individuals within the People of Praise. Next weekend, on the 16th of September, I will be in Glasgow, Scotland, giving a live talk on the big stage for CrimeCon UK, sponsored by CBS Reality. CrimeCon is the biggest UK true crime event, with panels, talks, immersive experiences, and book signings from some of the leading names in true crime. Tickets are still available but limited if you want to come along and watch my talk with Bexy Cameron, a filmmaker, author, and former member of the Children of God. Visit crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT at the checkout for 10% off your purchase. And if you are busy in the day but want to come along to the true crime quiz and hang out with all the guest speakers and content creators in the evening, there are now evening tickets on sale, where the code CULT will still apply at 10% discount. But enough of that, let's get on to the show. Here is this week's special guest, Pete Smith.
So hello, Pete, and welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to having this conversation today because although the conversations often descend into political talk on this show, the groups we discuss aren't necessarily directly linked with politics and government. But today's conversation might be a bit different in that way. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Hi, Casey. It was nice to meet you. My name is Pete Smith. I was raised in South Bend, Indiana, in the United States, and I grew up in a cult called the People of Praise.
Anybody that is unaware of the People of Praise, is there a summary of the history of the group, where it came from, and how it changed over time that you can give myself and the listeners?
Sure. The best place to start would be something called Vatican II, which happened in the Catholic Church when the Pope kind of changed the rules of the service. Um, Basically, if you could imagine attending a religious service and having a group of priests lead it, but they don't speak your language and they often don't even look at you. What happens over generations is that people tend to view that service as more of like a family tradition than a genuine religious experience or a way that they interact with the deity. So in Vatican II, the Pope said basically that, now instead of having all of our services in Latin, we're going to have them in the language of the people who attend. And we're not going to, have this strict Gregorian chanting, but there might even be guitar. And we're also going to allow something called lay ministry, which means that people who are not ordained priests are also allowed to carry out the work of the church, whether that's through trying to help people in poverty or any other ministry that they might determine would be a good use of their time. Allowing lay ministry opens the door for people to envision a new way in which they can experience their religion. So people who had this tradition of only just I'm Catholic because my parents were Catholic, because my parents were Catholic, because everyone in Ireland is Catholic, now can say, well, I'm going to manifest my religion in a new set of ways. And as people were thinking about this, two professors started trying to receive something called the gifts of the Holy Spirit that they'd heard about in other forms of Christianity. Their names were Ralph Kiefer and Bill Story. They were professors at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh in the United States. They felt like they had kind of reached a breakthrough, and they invited a bunch of students who were also interested in lay ministry to attend basically a weekend retreat. And there they prayed over people, and some of the people there actually claimed to receive the gifts of the Holy Spirit. What that means is that they believe that God blessed them personally, and that because of that blessing, they could now speak in tongues. Speaking in tongues would, for people who aren't aware, basically means that they can now speak a language which they previously had no knowledge of. This could be a real language or a made-up language. In almost every case, though, it's just made-up language. The following weekend, Bill Story and Ralph Kiefer come to the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. South Bend is a Rust Belt city in the United States. It's kind of like the Midlands in the United Kingdom. There's not a lot of greats happening there. It's impoverished in a lot of ways because the work is kind of outdated or being moved to other countries. And so it's very easy to get people to latch on to something that offers salvation, right? So these two professors come to Notre Dame and they do the same thing. They pray over more people. This happens in 1967. And some of the people they prayed over at Notre Dame, which is a big center of Catholic intellectualism in the United States, would go on to also receive the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and they would go on to found what is the People of Praise. But that would happen 4 years later in 1971. It was founded by two men. Their names are Kevin Ranahan and Paul DeSelles. They were both educated at Notre Dame, and one taught at Notre Dame, taught physics, Paul DeSelles, and the other was a teacher at the adjacent Catholic women's college called St. Mary's. They formed a group of people not necessarily associated with Notre Dame, but mainly people who just lived in the city of South Bend and hadn't attended Notre Dame. And they started with 29 people, including themselves and their wives. And they kind of operated like that for about 4 years. For the first 4 years, their main focus was using something they had created called the Apostolic Institute, which was to create permanent deacons, which are kind of lay ministers within the Catholic Church. And that's where they made an important connection, which would be Amy Coney Barrett's father, who also became a permanent deacon of the Catholic Church, not in South Bend, but in New Orleans. So that they were participating in something called the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Renewal meaning we're going to renew the church. Charismatic not meaning influential or having a gravitational pull. That's an academic Catholic word that just refers to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And obviously, this was very Catholic. Almost all the members in the very beginning were all Catholic and very Catholic oriented. Then in 1975, an adjacent covenant community to People of Praise was shut down and closed by the Catholic Church. And they kind of learned a lesson from that. They're like, we cannot be Catholic. We have to be ecumenical, because if we are Catholic, then we can be shut down by the church hierarchy. So with that knowledge in hand, they pursued ecumenical activity with a fervor, and they started having, there had always been national conventions for the Catholic charismatic renewal, but they started reaching out to Protestants and trying to form bonds across bridges that they didn't think they could cross together. And they adopted means that were already in use in a lot of Pentecostal churches, most notably the Assemblies of God. And then over time, this grew. And now most people would recognize the People of Praise because of its most famous member, Amy Coney Barrett, because she sits on the United States Supreme Court.
That was a really concise overview of the history of this group. So, I mean, it speaks to what you do for a living, but it also, I think, speaks to the amount of research that you must have done on the true history of the group before, after you left, because I imagine that when you're in the group, you are given one history, and when you leave, you realize that there's a slightly different one. So would you be able to tell the listeners what it is that you do for work?
Sure. I've worked as a professional journalist for 15 years after graduating from Indiana University with a degree in journalism. When Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court, I had a visceral reaction. I was like, I cannot believe this is happening. I cannot believe that they're going for this amount of power. Because to know the People of Praise to grow up in is to know that not everyone is welcome. They recruited people from Notre Dame's graduate school specifically because they wanted members who were going to assume positions of power. When I was growing up in South Bend, they had members in state government, city government. They were always trying to gain influence, and they were recruiting people who would take those positions, who already had wealth they could contribute to the People of Praise for their benefit. So it was shocking that they would try and make such a big power grab, because this is a very tiny group. When I was a kid, they probably had maybe 1,000 to 1,200 members in South Bend, and I don't think they ever were above 20,000 members worldwide. But it's not a massive religious movement. It was always very small and insular, and it was shocking. And I did what everyone else did who had survived it. Most People of Praise kids, we can call them second generation, I think, because your audience is educated enough in that terminology. They run from it like the plague when they become adults. They don't want to look back. They want to pretend it never happened. And even as kids, we didn't really talk about it amongst ourselves. There was always this assumption that we were in it, that we'd always been in it, and we always would be in it. But kids are forced to make a choice, which is when, you have to choose to be what they call underway, which is kind of a 2 to 5 year period where they indoctrinate you basically, and then make you sign a lifelong covenant to be a part of it. Most kids don't want any part of that, so they never go underway, and they don't make the covenant. They just leave, and that family relationship becomes strained. So all these second generation kids across the country reached out to each other on a one-on-one basis, but we started making connections. Because I grew up in South Bend, I didn't know People of Praise members in Minneapolis or Washington, D.C. or Portland, Oregon, or any of these cities. I lived in my little city, and that was my group. But we found each other, and we just started talking. And we realized that we had a ton in common. And that, in me, really spurred me to research the history of the People of Praise and understand what it was that I belonged to. Because that assumption of we're just in this, we always will be, well, it hadn't played out, right? I was an adult now. I was 40 years old. I was no longer in the People of Praise. I hadn't talked to these people. I didn't want to talk to them. And I wanted to know what I was a part of. And what I found was It was beyond anything that I had recognized as a child. My childhood wasn't particularly great, and I felt like I suffered alone. It was very I don't know, just it reaffirmed my experience, I guess, to find other people um who who had been through the same things that I had.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on chumbacasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at chumbacasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's chumbacasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18 plus.
Thank you for sharing that, Pete. It's a really incredible thing when survivors talk about finding other people when they really felt like there was nobody else in the world that could possibly understand what they'd experienced. And it's clear that this community that you have found has had a big impact on your life. So it's through these types of conversations that some of those connections are made, and who knows what can come from this conversation today in terms of people hearing your story and feeling the way you have felt in that validation from other people's experiences. So it's a really powerful thing when people are brave enough to come forward and share their experiences. So I appreciate you being here today to talk to us about this. In your email to me, you mentioned that your parents joined the People of Praise when they had moved to a new community and were seeking to become involved somehow or feel at home or find a place where they belonged, which is a common time in people's lives when we hear about individuals becoming wrapped up in destructive groups and groups that have hidden agendas and abusive practices. And I wondered if you would be willing to just talk us through what you recall about that time, and what you have learned, if you have learned anything from your parents in how they were approached by the People of Praise.
My parents were from the American South, which is very distinctively different than the Midwest, where I would be born and raised. My father moved with my wife to South Bend to attend graduate school at Notre Dame. And it's South Bend, like the Midlands, is very cold, isolating place. There's not a joyful atmosphere there. And so if you're from a warm place where everyone is very outgoing and welcoming, it's very difficult. One of the things that People of Praise used to their advantage was that they had a prayer group on the campus of Notre Dame. It was had its meetings right above the main dining hall at Notre Dame, so that whenever you went to eat, you could hear this group singing very loudly and boisterously, and it would be like, hey, they didn't have to have like some weird cult messenger have an awkward conversation, be like, hey, you want to come to the cult meeting? Like, you would just hear these people. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to play one of their main
Yes,
songs.
please.
Most of their music, they keep it pretty close. They sing a bunch of songs that are only used within the charismatic renewal, and so the average person would never have an opportunity to really hear this kind of music. But it's very loud, and it draws you in and makes you curious. So it's very easy for a lot of strangers to just walk in and be like, hey, what's going on here? Everyone's involved. Everyone sings all at once. They're clapping. At the end of the song, they sing in rounds. Like, it's very animated and emotional. And
You were walking past, I think you'd be curious. You'd want to know what's going on in there. It's like street performers when there's a big crowd of people in the street where the shops are, and you're walking past and you're like, why is this big group crowded around? I'll go and join them and see what it is. I think I would definitely be curious to find out where all of those sounds are coming from, especially if it's live. It's different hearing something over the speakers. I imagine if you walked past and you could hear that it was actually people making that noise in the moment, I know I would be curious to see what that was like. Being told that there are intellectual aspects of the people of praise. Before we hit record, we had a discussion about those things. This seems like one of those things. It's a slightly different recruitment tactic, and I imagine it can be quite effective.
oh, they definitely use love bombing. When you are first showing interest, but at least at Notre Dame, this was the recruitment. It was, having their prayer meeting above the central dining hall and then using their music to draw people's interest. And when they started when the people of praise started controlling that prayer meeting in 1975, that's how they started to grow pretty rapidly.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
So my parents were involved in that. And they quickly, within 2 years had made the covenant and had become full-fledged members of the people of praise. Eventually my father would stop pursuing an academic career and join the people of praise's primary business, something called Charismatic Renewal Services. Basically, that was at the time one of the largest Christian book distributors in the United States, certainly in the eastern half of the United States. It dominated. It would have been originally created to distribute like the print materials and all that kind of collateral you need to create this movement where all the diverse charismatic prayer groups throughout the country would start adopting the same practices and using unified teachings and unified materials. They would kind of try and create a unified presence, because all these charismatic prayer groups had sprung up in the late 60s across the country. There were, I think by 1973, about 1,200 of them, which basically is like every decently sized city in the United States. And so the leaders of this were really Kevin Ranahan and Paul Lascelles, the two people of praise leaders, as well as Ralph Martin and Steve Clark, two people who ran a charismatic or covenant community in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And there was another person involved too, but he didn't make it. So by 1975, basically this group of 4 men had pushed, using CRS, which is kind of what we call it internally, to send, a unified message to all the prayer groups and encourage them to be covenant communities. And then from 75 to the mid 80s, people of praise in Ann Arbor began kind of absorbing all of these covenant communities across the country, to the point where there was no longer 1,200 prayer groups, but that people of praise controlled a large amount of covenant communities. Word of God in Ann Arbor became sort of the Spirit, kind of like as an umbrella agency, and controlled a large number there. And then maybe 10 to 15 other covenant communities kind of stayed on their own.
So it's like a giant vacuum cleaner that they've been able to pull in all of these things through this book distribution and printing business. That's quite impressive, really. It sounds like there was a lot of strategy and planning involved in terms of expanding under everyone's noses the operation that they had, and not explicitly saying, hey, we're here, we have all these places you can come and meet us. Would you say that's kind of how it looks to have happened?
So I'm willing to allow that first generation members had genuine religious experiences. I'm willing to allow that, but that certainly wasn't my experience, and I think it's because of this other side of the movement, which was building the physical infrastructure, the buildings, the businesses, things that make these communities possible and enable them to do what they do. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we're a community, we're going to live this intense life, but everyone needs a building to have weddings or dinners or whatever, and so who's going to pay for the building, right? Who's going to maintain the building? And it very quickly grows into all these physical things that are needed. And so there's that adjacent side, right? There's the religious meetings that happen on a Sunday afternoon, but there's also the all-consuming part of building the infrastructure that kind of takes on more importance, frankly, in the leader's eyes, at least.
Is this an example of potential labor trafficking that takes place inside the People of Praise?
Not at the beginning. In the beginning, they were mainly trying to recruit people who would take positions of power, but those people had kids, and so they very quickly realized, we need to educate these kids, not just at the parish school when they're in elementary school, or but also when they go into what's called a high school in America, and in college as well. And we need to try and push them into positions of power as well, because eventually they kind of turn their focus from recruiting graduate students at universities across the country to raising their kids to do the same thing. And at that point, there were probably a 2-decade period where they hadn't really necessarily found the mojo to grow internally. I guess they had always just absorbed other groups, but in the mid 90s they realized that a lot of their kids were leaving and not coming back, just like I did. And so they kind of switched tactics. And Paul DeSales, who's he fills the role of chief missionary and kind of the brain trust of building the physical infrastructure stuff, he decides that we need to give kids a purpose. And so he declares to have this vision that the People of Praise needs to build, 200 cities by the year 2045. And he starts training kids to become leaders to carry this out. And those child leaders would in turn, bring in their friends to go on mission trips. And the purpose of the mission trips wasn't necessarily to evangelize. I mean, I guess that was part of it, but really it was to go into dilapidated neighborhoods, fix up houses, kind of take over a neighborhood, and then show people in that dilapidated neighborhood that, good things will happen if you work with these people.
Right.
So it's a different variation on encouraging people to see their good works as opposed to hear their good music, right? But it's the same general idea. We're not going to have an awkward conversation like a bunch of traveling Mormons. We're going to, show you something first to prove that we're for real, and then you're going to want to join us because you know how bad it was before we came to your neighborhood. And for that, they do traffic children across state lines, which is a crime in the United States. You can't traffic children across state lines and not pay them the minimum wage, which is exactly what People of Praise does. But they get away with it because no one in our country wants to investigate a religion. And I guess that brings us to the crux of the issue. Is People of Praise a religious group, or is it something else?
Yeah. And I ask myself that question a lot in terms of religious groups that have known cases of human trafficking of various types, whether it's for sexual exploitation, labor trafficking, both, whether it's child labor trafficking or child trafficking, or all of the above. And with the People of Praise and the second or multi-generational adults who are now finding each other in later life, now that people have been able to escape the group and find one another, it's things like human trafficking as opposed to coercion that may allow some type of legal action in the future. I know that there is there's a woman called Carol Murchison, who I have interviewed on this show, who helps people take legal action against sexual harassment and misconduct inside religious and spiritual groups. And because of things like statute of limitations, and because of things like coercion not being recognized as something illegal in the States, and even, you know, in the UK, it's seen as a serious crime, but only in intimate partnerships and families. So even in a group setting, it's still not something that can be charged as a serious crime. But human trafficking is now what Carol and her team will look to be able to get those charges put onto people that have committed crimes that link to coercion and sexual abuse. So human trafficking as a recognized law across America, not just state to state, but, you know, as a country, is something that is becoming more and more recognized, I think, and that is very good news to people that want to take that legal action. And the timeline that you've given us in terms of the people of praise, where they came from, how they changed, and where they are today, where is it that you come into that particular timeline in the group's history?
So 2 years after my parents made the covenant, I was born in 1979. I wasn't in the first cohort of children who were born into the people of praise. I was probably what you call the second, but, you know, very early in their beginnings, and they hadn't fully understood, you know, they didn't have a fully realized plan for how to get children from birth to making the covenant as an adult. And so I think that gives me a good perspective on what the people of praise is. Because that plan wasn't in place, I feel like they did a lot of experimenting on me and my friends. And I feel like, you know, under Paul Lascelles' leadership, basically what the people of praise functioned like, from my perspective, was a giant experiment. What can we do to this kid to shape him or form him is what they would use. And how do we get him to grow into the person that we want him to be? And a lot of the indoctrination that happens occurs along an authoritarian chain of command. Basically, Paul Lascelles and Kevin Ranahan sit at the top. Lascelles, again, as the kind of the brain trust and physical infrastructure. Kevin Ranahan functions as kind of like the prophet.
Right.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
One of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is prophecy, and basically his prophecy is the only stuff that the members listen to, at least in South Bend. And underneath them, they had a series of lieutenants. And then they would have, you know, people involved in various organizations, like their education effort, or they had these things called brotherhood and sisterhood. Those were where people lived celibate lives. They called it being single for the Lord. But what we always assumed as kids was that those people were just gay in the brotherhood and sisterhood, and that they had been forced into a life of celibacy because they were not allowed to be their true self. I can't say that that's 100% true for all of them, but I would suspect that a significant number of them, if not 100%, would identify as LGBTQ given the chance. But
So this,
they had
sorry, I just wanted to make a quick. So you having this idea as a child that these two groups of people might be made up by individuals that identify as part of the LGBT community leads me to assume that from a young age, you're taught that that's not something the church allows or encourages at all.
Okay, so just a quick point of clarification. The church is the Catholic Church. People of Praise has nothing whatsoever to do with the Catholic Church. I will allow that a majority of the members from 1971 to 75 were Catholic, but again, they adopted ecumenicism, and they very quickly became a cult. I mean, there's no other way to mince it. Um, the first In the early days of the 70s, they had a lot of researchers and anthropologists studying this movement because it was a groundswell that happened in the United States and not necessarily around the world, at least for the Catholic Church. So a lot of priests were studying this academically. And one of the primary researchers from the very beginning was a guy named Fichter. And his first book is called The Catholic Cult of the Paraclete. Paraclete is academic Catholic for Holy Spirit. So the very first book identifies this as a cult. So let's not, I'm not going to mince words about this whatsoever. There is no doubt in the studies or history of this group that it's a cult. The only reason that people even debate this is because of a people of praise strategy that most journalists are susceptible to. In 1975, there was a 6-part investigation by the National Catholic Reporter newspaper in the United States, and it identified them and the Ann Arbor group as a cult. And at the end, the reporter likened its leaders to Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, he did this in print. This isn't, it's out there. Anyone can find it. If people ever want to email our group, we'd be happy to send it to them. We have a website, popsurvivors.com. But but I feel like I've lost my train of thought a little bit.
We were talking about I used the word church. I should have used the word group, but I was talking about the LGBT community within the church. Because as a child, you must have had you must have been taught some things to know that
so within this hierarchy, there's Paul DeSales and Kevin Rand at the top. They're lieutenants, they're specialists. Then there's kind of city coordinators, is what they call them. And then there's like area coordinators. Then there's something called a head. A head supervises an individual member and then kind of reports information about that member up the chain of command. So they compile this huge database about people's most intimate details and lives and store that only the head leaders can see. Information doesn't flow in reverse. And then from the head, there's the individual member. If it's a man, he would supervise a wife. If it was a single woman, she would be supervised by another head called a handmaiden. And together, the husband and wife supervise their children. So children sit at the very bottom of this authoritarian chain of command. And if children are to receive a message like, don't be gay people are bad, whatever, it usually comes from the mother. So that's kind of how they receive their instruction. And because of the intensity of that relationship, and there's no other word but intense, parents didn't look at their children as like objects that they loved. In the vast majority of times, they looked at them as objects that they had to shape or control, or a possession even. And so they would tell you very early on, abortion is wrong. And they don't need to say it a billion times. They don't need to put it in writing. You don't need to hear it at the meeting. You just know because your parents told it to you in absolute terms. And you don't question anything your parents say unless you want a physical beating. And so that's kind of like how young children in this group absorb, the idea that this was a bad thing. I personally don't know why I never absorbed that lesson. I mean, I know that I was told that, and I know that it was reinforced throughout my childhood in different ways by people of praise adults, but it never stuck. It always seemed like ludicrous. Like, this whole idea that they push on you that God is this person who cares about you as an individual and wants to be involved in your individual life and made you to serve a purpose. Well, it doesn't take much. I mean, I think at the intellectual age of like 7, I could realize that if God made me this way, he also made gay people gay. Like it's not this, thing that requires an advanced set of knowledge. Like it's very simple to understand. And it was very simple to understand that the adults were lying to me. And so an experience of overwhelming hypocrisy on the part of adults is part of being a people of praise child. You learn to hear it, you learn to understand it, and you learn not to say anything. You just keep your mouth shut. I think we were trying to talk about something larger though before. Could you refresh my memory about
Yeah, we were
original question?
talking about where you came into that timeline, and you were talking about how there was a lot of experimenting going on, and that's where the mention of the brotherhood and sisterhood came up. So I think you were just talking about the different elements that existed within the groups in terms of different kind of branches within the umbrella.
Mm-hmm. And so my parents were Protestant, which has made us different. And but that's all part of the experiment, right? Paul DeSalles doesn't care about whether you're Protestant or Catholic, because this isn't the church. This is a cult, and he's running an experiment. And what he wants to do is run mice through his maze and find out the results. So I'm just the Protestant mouse, and it's just more data, that he can gather. So my parents also, my father worked for CRS, which is their primary business. So that also differentiated our family. We weren't just any member, we were also, a family that generated a lot of money for them. But that didn't necessarily put us in a position of power, because we were Protestant, because my parents were from the South, because my dad could come off as arrogant, which I could explain, but it isn't worth it for the point. Basically, it was very easy for him to be perceived as arrogant. So they would punish him in a form called servant leadership, where they force him to serve. And so it was a very common experience for me and my brother to, clean up the People of Praise's main building in South Bend. They owned a giant 9-story hotel in South Bend where they had most of their functions and where they ran their businesses. Or if Kevin Ranahan and Paul DeSalles were eating lunch at their, cult restaurant at the first floor of that building, we'd have to, bust their table and wash their dishes or something like that. So we were in proximity, but that was not access. That was not power. That was just, them observing us to make sure we were being humbled enough.
You mentioned something about the signing of the covenant, and I wonder what the consequences would be.
It's not a signing. It's a vow. You stand on the floor, surrounded in a fishbowl by the entire group, and you make a vow in front of everybody.
What age are people typically when they take that vow?
So in the beginning of People of Praise, they were recruiting graduate students. So they would start off at maybe like 23 to 27. They'd be underway from anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And during the period of being underway, they would live in something called household, where the single person looking to join lives within a family. And the goal is to have family life, an ideal People of Praise life modeled for that person, so that the People of Praise leaders don't need to explain in great detail what it looks like, but also so they don't put it in writing. This very quickly becomes apparent why. And that modeling of life is how you're expected to live. And if you don't make it, you wash out and disappear, and they move on to the next person. So you might end up making the covenant about the age of, like, let's say 25 to 30. And at that point, you've probably had something called a discernment, which is whether you and your People of Praise head have determined that either you're going to live single for the Lord or you're going to get married. And so that all kind of happens in very quick order. It's not like someone makes the covenant and then just goes off and lives this dating lifestyle, hoping to seek a husband or a wife, whatever it may be. Basically, when you make the covenant, you're either already married to someone who's going to also make the covenant, or you're going to be married within a couple months.
That is the end of part 1 of this People of Praise mini-series. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.